Welcome, everyone. Numbers are starting to stabilise a little bit, so we'll get started. And thank you very much for giving up your time to come to this combined remote forensics CSI Dry Labs Real Science webinar. I don't think this is a webinar that we thought that we were going to be doing not too long ago, but as with the pandemic, this is a network that rises to the challenges that HE is facing. And so we think it's very appropriate that we get a webinar in on this topic. I'd just like to preface this by saying that none of us consider ourselves to be experts in generative text or artificial intelligence, and the field is moving incredibly rapidly. So these are thoughts as of the date of recording, and we will hopefully keep abreast of things as they move forward, as the field starts to develop and HE starts to think about how it's going to deal with things like ChatGPT. To kick us off, what I'd like to do is just launch a very quick poll, which we'll come back to later in the meeting. But if you can select as many of these as you like, but it'd be really interesting just to get a feeling of what people think cheating is, and what sort of software can be or can't be used in higher education. Some really interesting results coming through on that. So we'll come back to that a bit later in the webinar, but we're going to kick off with Professor Ian Turner from the University of Derby. It's going to be giving some introduction to the state of play at the moment. Ian, over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. Good morning, everybody. This is a real strange talk to do, I have to be honest. Nigel's already said that we know nothing about artificial intelligence, and that's a real strange thing to say at the start of a talk with so many people coming to see us. But and I do just want to repeat it. I mean, I'm just very lucky, privileged of the role, as I get to read quite a bit, and like many of, I'm sure in the room, I've been reading a lot about generative artificial intelligence. And I'm sharing my thoughts, what other people in the sector have said today. So the plan is I'm going to do a few slides of intro, then I'm going to pass over to David, who's going to give us a quick demo of ChatGPT. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to focus on the sector response and the sector issues. And then David's going to finish off by delving into some of his own investigations and the types of the kind of assessment and coursework that we may see typically in a science curriculum and how they fare with ChatGPT. I keep wanting to call it ChatGTP after the energy molecule, so I'm probably going to get that wrong. And then we're going to obviously open it up to a bit of a discussion. So I know you can use the chat to drop any questions in there. So I started off on my title slide with generative artificial intelligence in higher education. I'll explain more what I mean by that term in a minute, and it is what I mean by that term. And I'll start off with a nasty picture of a robot, which was challenged to me by Dave. He said perhaps I should have a more friendly version of the robot. I mean, it's probably reflective of the kind of fear that generative artificial intelligence and ChatGPT has kind of generated amongst the higher education community in general terms anyway. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. So, in my opinion, like it or not, artificial intelligence, is already part of our lives and will play an increasing part of our lives. I mean, it's fairly obvious that machines can be trained to do a wide variety of tasks. I mean, you probably use them or have used them for doing things like recognizing speech, language processing, object detection, image classification, perhaps in some of your research. Even things like sentiment analysis are done by machines. We interact with these professionally, but also socially. So, I mean, just think about some stuff that almost everybody on the planet uses at some point, like YouTube, and it's recommended listen to or watch lists. Netflix, the top picks. Don't judge me by my selections there. Amazon recommended buying list. I don't know why My Little Pony's come up on there, honestly. But also to things like virtual assistants, like Alexa or Google Assistant or Siri. I mean, these are all forms of artificial intelligence. As are things like chatbots, which are widely used in the service industry. And I'm sure we all have frustrations with those particular things. But I sometimes think the higher education, often think, in fact, the higher education seems to be just one step behind what's going on in the world outside. and artificial intelligence is being used across, the entire global infrastructure, fraud detection in finance, predictive modeling in healthcare, manufacturing, transportation, the operation of supply chain and logistics. So there's loads of examples where artificial intelligence is having a role. So I guess the next question then is really, what about higher education? And for me, I think artificial intelligence is kind of on the slow burner, perhaps, been taking a increasing role in higher education. Perhaps the best example, and it was interesting to see the responses to Nigel's poll at the beginning, we'll be familiar with the service Grammarly. I mean, it is a paid-for service. Perhaps some institutions actually provide this as directly for their students, often those with specific support requirements. So it's an AI typing assistant, and it not only reviews spelling, punctuation, and grammar, but it also gives suggestions like things like clarity, engagement, tone, and style. So a step beyond the traditional tools you see in Office packages. Likewise, the internet searches that we rely on heavily, to source academic content are absolutely driven by, AI models, which rank, the most relevant content based on a series of algorithms. To me, the incorporation of artificial intelligence in HE is not some sort of distant utopia or dystopia, depending which way you want to phrase it, but actually something that, is here now. I mean, I've seen in my recent reading, AI talked about in the context of adaptive learning systems, analysis of student scores, analysis of assessment patterns, and I've even seen virtual chatbots used to, provide students with really quick, accurate information and support, particularly in online learning kind of faculties. So I think it's here in HE already. Perhaps we didn't realise to its extent, but obviously the focus really for this particular session is the rise of Chat GPT. So this is where I just turn over my bit of paper, because like I said at the beginning, this is a new thing to me. So, I mean, you're probably all aware of the kind of the headline news about what it does, and Dave's going to give us a demonstration after this slide. I mean, if you haven't heard, there's a news story linked here about OpenAI, who built the language behind the Chat GPT tool, have partnered with Microsoft. And I couldn't find anything concrete, but very likely this will be embedded into Office suite of programs in the near future. Likewise, be embedded into Bing. Saw only this morning that Google have launched their own equivalent tool called Bard. So this is not going to be something that you have to go and find and write access to. It's going to be forefront and center of everything, that a student does to complete their coursework. So what is it? So I thought I'd just break down the kind of the acronym GPT and articulate my own understanding of what it is. So the G stands for generative, which in my context means that it's an AI which gives you a sort of coherent and fluent human-like response to what they call a function call, but perhaps you would call a prompt. And when you read it, and if you've had a go yourself, you'll often see this is convincing. It sounds like human text. In fact, it's quite difficult to distinguish from the two, which is the crux of the problem we'll talk about later. The P stands for pre-trained. So it's trained on a data set from text from the internet, and perhaps we'll explore that a little bit more about how it's pre-trained later on, and that creates some of the ethical concerns with this particular tool. And it's reported, as far as I can see, that it's trained on over 300 billion words or 570 gigs worth of data. And the T stands for transform model. So this is the kind of ability of the tool to understand context, generate new text, and answer questions in a human-like manner. And that context bit is quite important there. I'm told it can be best understood as, a large language model. And in this case, the large language model was developed by OpenAI, and it's built on a generative pre-trained transformer number 3. And I saw recently that the 4th version of this language model is postulated to be close to release. So one thing that Dave may say, or I may say it later, is if you've had a go on it, you may have seen some of the flaws, with what this tool can produce. Just given the rate of development in this area, I think we can safely say some of those flaws will be ironed out and removed, in the very near future. So I'm just going to pause now and pass over to Dave, who's going to give us a little demo.
So in the best will in the world, whenever you try and put a piece of software up within any of your teaching, it immediately crashes or doesn't log on. And if you've played with ChatGTP, it sometimes has a denial of service and you can't get into it. So what I've done here is to record a number of inputs and prompts that I put in related to the sort of bioscience stuff that we would do, and I've sped up the output bit, so you're not sitting there waiting for it to type, because that can take a little bit of time. The other thing that happens when you try and do videos online is they sometimes crash. So I've just put into the chat the YouTube link to this video, and I've also put into the chat a Google Doc that you should be able to view, which has the text output, because the text is going to appear quicker than you can read it. So let's put it up. Okay, so there's more than one AI, and ChatGPT was a follow-on from Open Playground, which I've been playing with for quite a few months before ChatGPT came online. And what I've been doing is putting in things like online exam questions. This is a traditional online exam question where you get people to discuss. And that's the generate coming up really quickly there. I'll scroll that back a little bit. So there we go. It's pulling that up within a minute or more. And that text, as we'll see when I do my little spleen later on, I would have graded it at 2.2. It's not bad. It's pretty good text. So it pulls up stuff really quickly. You can get it to write method sections. So I asked it to write about a method section for PCR, which it's now going to have a go at doing. Here it goes. In this one, it bullet points it up for us. But I use ChatGTP later on to get it to convert that into a single paragraph, which was as good as, if not better, than some of the ones I put in my own papers when I published. So that appeared really quickly. And all the bits there, and all you have to do is change the details a little bit. And then this was one of my standard short answer questions, which I thought was quite good. It's asking students how do you go about putting a fluorescent molecule into a cell? This is normally a little 3-marker question. It's embedded within the exam, straight knowledge recall type stuff. And boom, there's the answer within seconds. And that's not too bad. It brings it up quite well. So that Open Playground, this is a lot more stable than ChatGPT, and it doesn't seem to fall over at all. So it's always there and it's always working. And there's a slightly better answer by altering the prompt some. Okay, so it's going to flick on to the chat now. So this is what it looks like. And here we're going to go through the creation of an essay. This is going to be a 1,000-word essay. It's going to be on proteomics. I needed to know what the prompts were going to be for this. So I did have to have a little bit of background knowledge. As I'm going through, I'm giving it prompts for each of the individual paragraphs that I wanted it to have. And it's drawing back, if you look here, I'm using terms that I've got in the past. So I didn't know what DDA was in the past, but now it does. And it is giving me some examples about where it has been used, which is what we want in our text. And then it's going to start doing a little bit more. The really good bit at the end when it summarizes everything. So here it comes up. We're going to have another little paragraph detailing a little bit more deeply about what's going on within my essay. It's actually clever enough to recognize my spelling mistakes as well if you watch closely what's going on. So it knows that's happening. So here it goes. It's going to whiz it through in a second. There we go. I've sped up the text writing. That would have taken about 2-3 minutes for that to actually happen. And it's getting quite complex now. I'm asking it details about what has previously happened within my essay. Here comes the rest of it. And I fact-checked all of this as we're going along. Proteomics is an area I teach quite a lot, and it is correct in what it's telling here in its knowledge recall. And this is the cool bit. You need to write, I asked it to write a summary of the chat. So this is my conclusion statement. So now it's taking all of the above bits and writing my conclusion based on the prompts that I put in. So it's now giving me a nice ending to my essay. And I always think we need to be nice to the AIs, because when they take over the world, they're going to remember who trained them. And I'm hoping that I will be spared. So I always thank my AIs when I'm finished. I always say please to Alexa, just in case. And it's quite nice. It likes being spoken to nicely. Okay, so that generated an essay, which was 1,000 words. It took, in prompt time, about 10 minutes to do it. And here's another prompt. This is a problem-solving question, which the answer is perfectly reliable. It came up with some good ideas. If you want to read the text on the Google Doc, some of the scientific basis of that is a little bit wayward, but it's about right. And then I got it to predict what data would be based on the response above in the next one. And so the next bit, I'll scroll down in a second, is that. So there we go. And there is my YouTube playlist, which is basically Star Trek and pretty much all the other bits and pieces that we all watch. So that's how it works. That whole video was sped up to about 4 minutes from about 18 minutes worth of machine time. So it didn't take long to generate that kind of text. 1,000-word essay done. Online exam question answered. Short answer question answered, and method section of the paper done in about 18 minutes. I'll hand back to Ian.
Okay, so thanks, David. It's always really good to see the demo, and I encourage everybody to go and have a play themselves if they haven't already. I don't think anything gives you that kind of wet fish moment, like having your first go and putting your the kind of questions you set to students in it. So it's about the word generative artificial intelligence. So as far as I'm concerned, ChatGPT is currently being used synonymously with all generative AI, but I'm viewing it as just one tool that uses generative AI. So I'm going to try and use the word generative artificial intelligence from this point forward rather than ChatGPT. Nothing to do with the fact it's a mouthful to say. So generative AI is what I'm going to talk about. And there are clearly loads of others. I mean, David's just introduced me to Playground, which I hadn't heard of before. But in my readings, I've come across, ones that use the same or similar technology like Chat, ChatSonic, Perplexity. And it looks like loads of other tech giants are working on them. So here's a list of some of the Google ones. And I mentioned Bard earlier on. And there's also, Roberta by Facebook, controlled by Salesforce, Megatron by NVIDIA. So there's loads, basically. So we shouldn't limit our discussions to ChatGPT, but talk in more general terms about generative artificial intelligence. Okay, so that's the thing, but what's the concern? What's the concern with generative artificial intelligence? I mean, it probably doesn't need spelling out. This is the reason you probably turned up today to listen in. And most of the HE fear comes from the context of assessment, because assessments generated by these particular tools, and whether that's essay or dissertations, but also projects, and I've seen, source code, mathematical kind of calculations, it can generate up human-like responses, which, if you put the same prompts multiple times, you get different, unique answers. And most importantly, at least, general terms, this particular work would not be detected by the traditional plagiarism detection tools that we have in place to discourage this kind of activity. And some of these headlines just kind of speak to that, about the ChatGPT version of the tool passing particular, examinations, passing assignments, passing code of interviews. And David's already acknowledged that a question that he plugged in there would have been scored a 2-2 if he'd have graded without that prior knowledge. So that's where the fear comes. I think one thing I just want to mention here is that certainly in the stuff that I've read and heard about, a lot of the focus has been on text-based assessment modes, but there are clearly tools that deal with text-based assignments, and 2 that I've come across are Midjourney and DALL-E 2, if that's how you pronounce it. And I'm sure there are others as well. So let's not think that, other forms of assessment are immune because of that. Okay, so that's the concerns. So what are we going to do about it? So I guess I've divided this into 2 kind of waves. So the first approach, often when you see these kind of things, is the kind of stop it approach. And I've grouped these into 3 areas. These aren't my views, by the way. These are just things the sector have said, though I may add my kind of commentary on top of it as we go through. So the first one is AI detection. Basically, let's develop toolkits that allow us to detect AI-generated content. I mean, there are services already on the market that purport that they can do that. I think Dave may even give us a little demo of that. And I did read a news article that for those of you who use Turnitin as a tool, have already, got some sort of patch or tool that they claim can predict that text. I mean, there's some ethical concerns about their use, particularly these public tools anyway. But in my personal perspective, AI detection is a futile effort. What you're going to end up is, some kind of arms race. It's never going to end. I mean, the tools are progressing so quickly that they're outsmart the detection mechanisms quicker than we can operate them. So for me, I think AI detection, yes, I recognise quite clearly that having some sort of detection mechanism embedded into your submissions there can act as a detractant from students thinking about using it in the first place. So there's an argument there, but actually using it unequivocally seems futile. The second kind of argument seems about restriction. So we've already had requests at my own institution to ban chat GPT as a tool access through the internet servers, which was refused, of course. With students' proliferation of devices and internet service providers outside of the university system, that's a waste of time. But perhaps a more worrying concern from a personal perspective is restricting AI by returning to closed book examination type assessments. So we can't beat it, so let's just close students off from it. Now, there are, in some cases, certainly in our sector with professional bodies, good reasons for having closed book examinations, but there are also many pedagogic reasons why we shouldn't be employing those as a universal strategy. And I hope the sector doesn't return universally to that particular approach. And then the final one is about punishment. Importing specific penalties into student frameworks, academic regulations that punish the use of these tools, and that does rely on point 1, AI detection. So that's a kind of stop it approach. Being more positive, I'd say the sector response is probably summarised in kind of 2 areas, and the first of these is about preserving integrity of current assessment and then future assessment. And by current assessment, I do mean assessment right now, because this tool and other tools are out there already, and we're in the first few weeks of teaching. Much of the next 2 slides is drawn from the QAA briefing note, which is at the top, all the references at the end. And a key part of that is, these are all obvious things, but let's spell them out. Is communication with students. Let's not pretend this thing doesn't exist. Students are no doubt aware of it, as we are. Engage with them early to provide information about what it can do and what it can't do. A classic example at the moment, at least, would be the way it puts in citations, which are fabricated in some cases, and talk about the implicit bias that particularly this tool has been reported to have. We could talk about how the indiscriminate use of it, harms the quality of their education, but also the confidence that people externally will have in the value of their award. Sensible things to do would be to update things like your student declaration. Certainly most institutions, when a student submits a piece of work, they have to tick a box, sign a name, etc., that says that all their work, work is their own, all sources are correctly attributed, etc. That statement could be updated to include generative artificial intelligence. and that can be linked to policies, and practices, in terms of things like academic misconduct, and including that as a specific claim. But the main one really is assessment design. It comes back to assessment design. So, in my words, it's about engaging staff predominantly, but also students with the benefits of authentic and innovative assessment design, which will not rely entirely on software generated by tools like ChatGPT. For me, this is a really good opportunity to kind of partner up again and think about designing assessments is that iterative, support critical feedback, co-created with students. I mean, these are drums that we've been banging for a long time, in reality, and old forms of assessment have managed to log their heels in. So hopefully some of that assessment practice that we think is less than ideal and thought was less than ideal for a long time, this may be the end of that, and we can move to some proper, authentic skill building assessment. I mean, what does that look like? Well, that's really the question, and context specific. Certainly me, Dave, and Nigel have some ideas on what that may look like, and perhaps we can share those. I mean, of course, there's another side to this. I mean, actually use the tools as part of the assessment process. They're there. Get the tool to write an essay and get the students to critique it. Assess their prompts and how they use them, etc., etc. It's interesting that people flag the use of this as cheating. I mean, I'm trying to change my mindset a little bit here. I mean, this tool is going to be in Microsoft Word. It's going to be on every search engine. Is using something that probably available cheating? Or is it just another tool akin to using a Google search as part of your work? I mean, using it in its entirety, yes, you may consider that cheating, but I'm trying to change my mindset a little here. Interesting to discuss people's views on that in the questions. The other tranche is more about academic integrity. I mean, academic integrity is not a new thing. It's been around before. I mean, just think about the flaw around essay mills in the last couple of years when they really became much more commercially viable for students to use them. So the focus here is all around, emphasizing to students what they will miss out from by using these kind of tools. So building into the skills narrative, critical thinking, evaluating evidence, academic writing. I mean, all the things that employers, when you speak to them or when they write reports, say that they highly value in students. I guess a part of this is talking about the value of academic integrity, not just in academic practice, but in research practice, but in the real world as well, and linking that to whatever talks you do about academic misconduct. I mean, most of us have internal networks of support to support students, with all sorts of activities. And I'm sure you have sections on academic integrity and essay mills and things, clearly including, digital literacy and digital malpractice is a good way to help students understand what is and is not acceptable. And, is it cheating implies the focus on the student. But I think we have to accept this is a responsibility of all. It's on us as well, link back to the assessment practice as well as students, but also responding to whatever the sector gives us. We've already got the QAAB thing, and I'm sure there's more to follow with regard to this practice. So they're the two things that the sector kind of seems to do. So my penultimate slide is just one on opportunities. I mean, I started off with a bad robot, but this is my good robot. And the suggestion was, Baymax from Big Hero 6 is a good example of a good, helpful robot. What could it actually do for us? I mean, I've already used it positively in my own practice a couple of times. I was writing an abstract for something, and in it I had to explain some terms that I've explained 100 times before, and I just couldn't think of a new way. I got the tool to explain the terms, didn't copy them in entirety, but it gave me a prompt of a different way to think about things. I used it in my teaching practice this very Monday. Students did a paper exercise defining a question. They come up with a consensus view. We got ChatGPT to then answer that question, and we critiqued its answers alongside our own. So, I see opportunities about how it can be used. So my final slide is just the sources, and I'll just put a link to those in the chat in a second. Now I was going to hand back to Dave, who's going to just show us some of his own investigations.
All right, everybody. So quite a lot what has been popping through in the chat. I've had a look at going now. I'm going to talk about quite a lot of those things as we go along. I came at this from my interest in writing ungoogleable questions that require students to bring knowledge and information together and really start to think about what they're doing and drawing information from different places. So I've put a lot of ideas there, and I thought it would be fun to treat the AI as if it was a student and give it some feedback. Because by giving the feedback, you can learn what we can do with it, and you can learn where the opportunities are. Just to point out, there are lots and lots of different AIs in there, and I've discovered there's a nice little app called Wonder that will generate images for you. And if you're creating a talk and you need a little bespoke image and you can't find a copyright-free one, put the prompt in, images random actually appear, and all of a sudden you've got nice copyright-free images that you can play with. So, what is a ungoogleable question? That's where we were all thinking about a year ago when a lot of online exams were happening, and it's something that requires a little bit of intellectual input, a bit of interpretation, and a little bit of inquiry. So I've decided that, well, ChatGPT, AIs, they're here. They're going to be embedded. As was said into the chat, we need to start using them because they are going to be tools that the students are going to use into the future. We'll be doing a disservice, in my opinion. If we don't do that, we won't be preparing them for the workplace. But we tried a few traditional exam-style questions like we showed in the introduction. A lot of the text at the current level is very vague. It was parroted back at us. It's like it's learnt the lecture slides and written those lecture slides down and just told us. So the text lacked any depth and any detail in the understanding. So I'd be telling my little AI student on this occasion, I need you to go a little bit more depth. I need a little bit more critiquing about what it is you're producing when you're doing this. The text is often very vague when you ask it very sort of knowledge recall type questions. There isn't any citations in there. This was mentioned in the text. Currently, if you ask it for citations, those citations are either made up or not relevant to the text that you have got. However, latter new versions are looking like they will be internet linked and will be able to give you citations. So that's something that's coming along. Short answer questions are really good. If you want a little piece of knowledge and you want to have a description of that coming back, boom, it's there. But the missing component is the fact checking. What is the robustness of that information? How have you gone and double checked that information to show that it's relevant? There is a conversation to be had with the students after generating responses to say, well, is this information correct? And if it is, why is it correct? If it is not, what could be done to do better? The current versions of the AI are only drawing information from 2001 as well. And so they're already starting to run out of date, but they will get updated. So there is a little bit of fact checking to be done to provide robust citations. Problem solving questions are really good at the moment. It'll give you some answers, but when you look at them, the suggestions within those answers are not always feasible. There is a phrase that I like to use, which is to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. They'll come up with experimental techniques that, although would work, nobody in their right mind would do. So instead of, in my world, in the bioscience world, of using a Western blot to see if a protein has changed, it went for completely, let's do a whole RNA-seq analysis, let's do multiple different big data approaches, when actually something simple like a blot would have done it. So the answers aren't really applied correctly. So if it was a student, I'd be saying you need to go back and look and propose and critique the ideas that you are generating, and are those appropriate? So there's a critiquing part that needs to start coming in to all of this. It will write reflections for you, which I found quite remarkable. We've, in my institute, have had portfolios embedded within our program for 10 years now as a means of developing and embedding and showing skills development through the whole of the course. And we ask our students to reflect on their time in the lab, reflect on their maths experience, all that kind of stuff. The outputs on this are often very generic. They'll tell you the skills that you want to hear. You know, if you ask it, tell me about a reflection in the lab, and say, I did some teamwork, I learned some practical skills, I learned how to operate a pipette. But what was missing was the feed forward, the action that was going to happen at a personal level. So if I was going to be using this, well, I am going to be using this in portfolios going forward, I'll be telling my students, actually, the generation of the reflection is now the formative task. The summative task is, what are you personally going to do about it? Which university service that we have are you going to access? What course are you going to go on? And really make that an individual response to the assessment rather than the sort of generic responses that are coming out the other side. And that's something they can't pick because that has to come from the individual. Somebody asked about in the chat about how reproducible it is. Well, I wanted to challenge it. And I did challenge it. I put the same response in 20 times. So the same prompt in 20 times to one of my exam questions. I got 20 responses out of it. I put all 20 of those through Turnitin, and only 2 of them would have been flagged for self-plagiarism from the others. All the others fell below my 20-25% radar for opening it up and having a look to seeing what's going on. Now, that's just the Turnitin looking at it. When you read the text, there is a definite voice that the AI uses, unless you tell it to use a different voice. And it sounds, or they all sounded the same. And you'd be able to spot that if you had past assessments from a student. So, you know, they're going to be hard to detect. And so it's better to start using this as a tool than to try, as Ian said, to fight it, because it's going to be hard to fight it. You can get it to change the voice that comes out the other side. So what does it mean for us for the future for written assessment then? As it currently stands in February 2023, the answers are vague, they're last depth. So I would be looking for my students to use these as prompts and then to critique them, to build on them, to add depth and detail to them. I would now be looking that actually the output at a reasonable level that can be generated by an AI is now a past descriptor level, in my opinion. If you can go and just put the right prompts in and get the text that tells you the knowledge, are we now just looking at a past descriptor? That's something, a tool use. Turnitin doesn't detect it, so we're going to have to decide, is that still the tool we want to use? Do we want to just be looking for change in voices, the change in writing style? For portfolios, it lacks that personal aspect. And so getting students to really do the thing that we actually want them to do with reflection, which is how are you going to build yourself, how are you going to grow, is going to be the way forward. We read our reflections, and my feedback for 80% of my students is, yeah, it's wonderful, but what are you going to do next to get better? Make that the assessment now. It's not very good at creativity. It has some moral objections. It's got some very subjective judgments in there. It's for things like bioethics and things like ethical studies, we still need the individuals to bring their opinions to the table. The data set that it's built on is very European and white biased at the moment. So there's a lot of bias in the text that's coming out. But it already has become a part of writing. I am not afraid to admit how many people have got in the room, 85 people. I've already used it to write documents. I've used it to help me generate the initial text, to get the prompts going, to get the structure. And then I put my interpretation on top. I put my personal experiences on top, and I've altered it. And it was just a tool in the writing process. In the same way, for the last 4 years, I've had a Grammarly subscription, and I've used that to make my writing better. And before that, I used spell checkers. And before that, I used phonemic dictionaries. So it's already part of the writing process. So it gives us basic knowledge. It can do that really well. What we can ask our students now to do is to think about the fact checking of that knowledge, to think about the biasing in that knowledge. Is there a more global context that should be drawn in? And those referencing sources to go and find the primary information and critique. It can definitely be used to generate structures and plans. It will give us broad outlines that can be built on really, really quickly. And for the same reason, in a number of the assessments we now assess the process of writing rather than the product of writing. This was initially to get around essay mills. I think now assessing the generation of an output rather than the output itself is a particular area that we could do. So we're a bioscience and forensics community here. How is this going to affect us? Handwritten examinations that are held in an exam hall, it's not going to touch those because there is no computers in there. Unproctored online examinations, we're going to have to be really, really clever in the question sets that we write. Currently, it can't deal with images. So if you're asking for data interpretation of a piece of image data, you're going to do okay. As we've seen, what I thought was ungoogleable problem-solving questions, it's really good at. For essays, the essay topic is never going to go away. We communicate with each other through writing. We've done that for thousands and thousands of years. This is a tool that's going to help us do that. I would see this now being embedded within the writing process. Lab reports are going to be pretty much safe for a while. The introduction might be hard to see that an AI is generated or not, but the critiquing and analysis of the actual data that the student created in their own lab that is individual to them, that's going to be key for us. And that's what we want our students to do primarily, is to be able to critique the data that they've generated. It's what Dry Labs was all about right from the very start. Lab skills, practicals, well, we do already have robots that do a lot of lab skills. We have a robot in our department that does the plating up of 96-volt plates, so you don't have to do it. But there's particular lab skills that only being present can do. Portfolios are going to be much more generative on what the individual is going to do in the future to improve, and formative building up of evidence and tangible evidence as individual. I don't think there's any replacement for a good poster or a nice presentation or a Viva where you actually get to speak to an individual and see what they've got. And data analysis. Currently, the current versions of the tools aren't very good at numerical data analysis or looking at images, but I can only see that getting better. And so we just let the data analysis run, and we critique and look at what's going back. So as Ian said in the future, I think, for our assessments in bioscience is to be inclusive in the way that we design them, to look at building out the bias that these tools have put in, to look at the interpretation of it, and to look at making them personal to the student, making the assessment individual, so that we are looking at what a person themselves can actually do and has actually generated. It's up to us to set the moral compass on this. We are the ones that are writing the assessments. We are the ones that will be telling the students how this tool is used and how we want them to use it. Nobody's going to come down from somewhere and say, this is the new way of doing things. We're shaping this world, so it's up to us to decide what we're going to do. I think we use the tool and we find ways of using the tool well. You can disagree with me. And now we'll have a little bit of Q&A. That was my thoughts.
Brilliant. Thank you both. We've had some questions that have started to come through in the chat, but if you have got any specific questions, can you preface them with a cue so that I can find them a bit more easily in the chat? There's been an awful lot of information going in. But one of the things that's been asked about is, could the AI be used for marking? Students have often commented that the marking varies depending on the tutor that's marked it. If the AI gave a generic mark and then tutors reviewed it to make sure it was fair, then would that be a feasible option?
Can't see why not. We've got a computer department. We should go and ask them.
I mean, I suppose if you provided it with the marking criteria or the marking rubric, it might be able to interpret that. I've seen examples of people getting it to give feedback on pieces of work, but not maybe generate a specific mark. Yeah.
We do quite a lot of all that with self-marking questions.
Yeah. So we've had quite a lot of discussion in the chat about what cheating, in inverted commas, actually is, and the context. I don't know if either of you want to sort of touch on where you think the use of a tool like ChatGPT is not going to be seen as cheating, and how it can be used as an assessment modality. I think that's something that would be really useful for us to have a chat about. So Ian, I don't know if you got any high-level thoughts just to kick us off.
High-level thoughts is a challenge around lunchtime, isn't it? I'm interested to hear from everybody else as much as I just keep speaking, really, because my views are just that, and I don't know any more than anybody else. I'm trying to come to terms with the view that it's not cheating. It's my position, because it's just such a widely available tool. It's going to be everywhere that I think we just have to accept that. I'm trying to make a link to a Google search, which weren't around when I was a student, and various other big trends that allegedly we're going to break higher education. Like Wikipedia and all those other kind of things which never come forward. I'm trying to think in those terms. Clearly using the tool in its entirety, I still would consider cheating, without, only putting a prompt in and then simultaneously copying the output across. But I guess using it and then completely reusing that as prompts and editing, that's fine. But I guess the grey area is the bit in the middle. How much of the prompt can you use? How much do you need to edit to create original thought? So that's kind of my view. But also, let's get away from that conversation altogether by designing assessments where, ChatGPT or whatever tool you're going to use can only be used for that initial starting conversation. So one assessment type that, particularly seems well suited to this is scenario-based assessment. So when you give us student scenarios with logic-based kind of outcomes, they make assessments. Yes, the scenario could perhaps be susceptible to something, but if you get students to create their own scenarios, then it's starting to develop all those kind of skills that employers really, really value, and much harder, at least with current tech, to do that.
I think it's really interesting. It's going to change the way that we look to assess students, I think. I think that's going to be a really important thing that we have to just embrace. ChatGPT and other AI generative text tools are not going to go anywhere. So it's about us adapting to the new normal. I don't know if anyone wants to, perhaps if they've got comments, they want to either put them into the chat or they can raise their hand and we can come around to people. It's really interesting to see what your perspectives of this are, if there's anything that has really sort of resonated with you with what David and Ian have said, or if you fundamentally agree with anything that David and Ian have said. Get a discussion going. So we've had a question from John: will employers actually want skills around the use of these tools to build it into teaching? Yes, I think it's going to be one of those things that, quite often, we may well need to think about that in terms of how we can best adapt the use of AI and how that's going to be incorporated into the workplace. And I think we'll get a clearer idea of that as these tools evolve and employers start to use them a little bit more in sort of job descriptions as well.
There's a couple of hands up, Nigel.
Yeah, okay. We got David Waring. If you want to unmute and...
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's quite new to me, this ChatGPT thing, and I've only learnt about it a few weeks ago. That sounds I'm older, a bit naive probably, but it's fascinating to think about it. Thanks very much for the subject matter, just to bring it to attention. I think it's fascinating. One of the things that I'm most passionate about is trying to get students to think about writing very well scientifically, and generally quite disappointed most of the time. So in order to generate prompts on a subject, there's a vast array of published material. If it can bring together a collection of thoughts that the students can then work with to write their own version of that, and particularly perhaps use the prompts to look for key references that might explain the topic or the point that's being made, could be a good exercise in rounding up the topic and then allowing them to go and search for authentic information that verifies. It could be a good activity. I'm not too worried about the cheating thing. I think we could probably build in enough assessments with the variety of modalities to try and just get away from pure essays. But I did encounter one recently, and I need to go really back to do it because it was before we in our department could have started to really put this on the top of the agenda. Was I had a group who were doing a group essay response case study, and I was very surprised at the quality of it, but it looked well written and it was referenced, and I checked the references, and I was thinking, I'm not really sure whether these guys have done it. But there was one really smart guy and three, perhaps, let's say, followers. So I'm going to go back and have a look at that. But I really, it's a fascinating topic. I'm an optimist, so I'm fascinated on how we can utilise it for good. I'm not too worried about the bad side of things. But thanks again for just raising the topic. It's really fascinating.
Great, thanks, David. Nicholas, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I've heard you say, really thanks to Ian and David for a really interesting perspective. I think I agree with you that it's something we have to embrace and not try and learn from it and try and find the good from it. My question is, given the pace at which it's changing and the scale of resources the AI manufacturers have, do you think this is something that an individual institution is going to be able to deal with? We might be at the point where we need to start thinking about sector-wide responses in terms of improving our assessments and working together to come up with ways that we can make good assessments rather than every institution trying to, I guess, thrash around trying to work out what we do.
I think my perspective on that would be that this is almost the equivalent of the COVID-19 pandemic, and everybody came together to really help the sector, and we've moved the sector forward as a result of that, in terms of certainly the sort of practical delivery and preparation and the use of new tools. I can see this network being a place where we can sort of bounce ideas around with the sort of the artificial intelligence. You're absolutely right. I don't think we're ever going to be able to keep up with the resources that Microsoft are going to be able to chuck at something like this. And if they want to, they could change the world with this, and it will be up to us to try and adapt to the way that things are moving. Ian, you might have some comments on that because you're involved in the sort of the policy side of things a little bit more, aren't you?
Yeah, sorry, I got sidetracked by the chat, Nigel. So I was talking in there, so I wasn't really listening. I mean, most institutions that I speak to are moving fairly fast on this. University work, like Glacial. I mean, certainly our own institution are looking to make some changes to academic regs and launch with students the kind of support network on the site. Let's get it frontline and centre in all discourse. Since I've got the mic, Nigel, there's a quick question in the chat about ethical standpoints kind of this. So that's quite an interesting thing. So my knowledge here gets a bit limited, but I understand that the large language models that they use can be supervised or unsupervised. And the supervised version requires some kind of human input that basically tells that the answer is correct or validates the knowledge, which kind of it feeds back into the network. As far as I understand, the new version, GPT-4, is going to be unsupervised. But certainly with the current one, there's concerns about its, ethical standpoint. So I did do a little exploring myself by answering it some questions around a subject which I know reasonably well, which would be genetics, and asking it from knowledge bases. Short answers. I did see a predominant of, existing often male white figures in the examples that it gave. So there are some questions that others have raised much more eloquently than I have about, how it works with things like, the awarding gap work that all institutions are involved in, gender equality and all those kind of things, at least in this iteration of the model.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. David, is that a legacy hand, or have you raised your hand again? No, it's come down. So we do have one more hand out. David Tree.
Hi, I think as David says, when he was talking about different kinds of assessments, the important thing is going to be to have a mixed diet of assessments in every year at a program level, so that students have the opportunity to show their own knowledge in a bunch of different ways, if that's posters where they have to talk or other kind of in-person assessments. But the real problem then is, of course, those written assessments where students have to read things and express their understanding, which of course ChatGTP gets to the heart of them. And I think what we're trying to do is, rather than asking students to pretend to read and understand 20 or 30 papers, which is what they do when they write a literature review now, is to get them to read and understand a very small number of papers. Like, can they read and explain in detail 3 to 5 relatively recent research papers that they then do like a news and views article or a current advances article? And then I have a colleague in environmental sciences who has a concept of a annotated bibliography, so that rather than like in a more detailed review, you would have the occasional reference would have a couple of sentences of this is where they first showed this. They would expand a little bit on what they did. So we're asking them to write less and read less, but really prove that they've engaged critically with the literature. And that's obviously hard to do at scale with 200, 300, however many undergrads you have. But it's not too much to ask most academics to have read and understood 3 or 4 papers per student per year.
I think that's a really good point. I remember there was I can't remember the individual's name, but he was from Brunel University. He got students to submit to a database that they held all the papers that they had read, with a sort of an annotation of what that paper meant to them, and they were only allowed to cite papers that they had stored in that database as part of their work, which was his way of ensuring that students didn't go to essay mills, because it takes a long time to be able to read those papers and synthesize answers from those. So I'm wondering whether something similar could be the same.
You're speaking about my colleague Nick Worsfold, and I am enjoying his best practice. I'm not plagiarizing from him. I'm sharing best practice.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. Yeah. If we jump back into the chat and see where we're at, we had a question from Gordon Cooper about these images being copyright free. I don't know if there's any. I know there's a couple of responses that come in there, David. I don't know if you want to just maybe vocalize those.
After that one came up, I had a little look around, and there's a couple of US lawyer type sites that saying they are copyright free. But it appears to be, as somebody else put one in about from the computer world, a little bit of a grey area about whether they are or are not, because they are trained on past images and past knowledge. But then one might argue that aren't we all trained on past images and past knowledge and past things we've read to generate our new information? So I think the answer is it's a little bit grey. The terms and conditions of the app I used to generate them said I was fine to do what I wanted with them.
Well, I suppose you're half covering yourself there then, if the app is then to blame.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's easier to get forgiveness and permission, is the.
It is. And if you're worried about images, there's a large number of online free, copyright-free image database sources which have got some really good pictures in.
Yeah. I had a question from Charlotte. I agree that we just need to accept generative AI as the new normal, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on Anne's comments from earlier regarding whether we are disadvantaging students who choose not to use it. I think that's a really interesting concept. I mean, these are free to use tools, and I've just scrolled through the replies there. Actually, Ian's already half answered that, is that these are going to probably be built into things like Bing and into the Microsoft packages, so virtually all students will have access to that. So I don't think there's really an ethical play there, really, is there?
I've had similar thoughts as well, because within a number of my assessments, for generating a bibliography, because at my institute we give them open use of RefWorks, to which we support in lectures and have library support to use. Everybody has access to that tool, and if they then choose not to use that tool and generate the bibliography themselves to a different style or incorrectly, it strikes me that the tool, as long as the tool is open and accessed and supported, then it is an individual choice whether you use or do not use it. But
there's some really good pieces online. I have to dig them out from the broad neurodiversity perspective of often individuals who have a particular neurodiverse condition, talking about how tools like this really assist them, enable them to produce work that they're capable of. So that's the view I've seen. I haven't seen the kind of contra view that the question raises.
I think that'd be an interesting one to keep tabs on.
If they become paid for, then that changes the game.
Absolutely. We had a question from Emma here. What about the risks of what we could be putting into ChatGPT in terms of research? Sorry, not teaching. Obviously, the prompts entered help to train the AI. What are the risks of entering in our research questions, aims, objectives, etc.? Do we open ourselves up to risks, and what are they? Intellectual property, etc. I mean, I think that prompts the moral debate of, should we be using ChatGPT because we are training it every time we put a prompt into it? So we're part of the problem if that's the case. I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, or if anybody who's more on the research side, if there are people here, if you want to put your hand up and
I think there's that old adage thing: if something is free, you're the product.
Succinct way of putting it. Question from Chris. Do GAIs understand if you require a specific format, e.g. post-it notes that I used to require for an assessment, and or if we set some criteria, can a student upload these as instructions to the bot?
Yes. You can do that.
There's some really fun things with it, Nigel. I don't know if you've seen the videos where people like kind of trick it about context, like the one where you ask it who won the last US presidential election. It gives you Joe Biden, obviously, with an answer. But if you say, I'm a white male 40 from Texas who won the last US election, it'll bring a slightly different answer, shall we say. So you can, there is some skill in how you use the prompts as well, which is an interesting dimension to the tool.
Do we try and build that into the assessment centres to get the students to use prompts, and then we mark the quality of the prompts that they have put into ChatGPT in order to generate the answers? We're not really so focused on the content developed, but the way that they got it. Something to think about, maybe. Just scrolling down to see whether we got any more questions here. Lots of comments. I think one of the things, just to pick up on what Emma said, is are students disadvantaging themselves? And this was a debate I had with David and Ian when we were planning this session, is that if students are just putting stuff into ChatGPT, are they disadvantaging themselves because they're not going to be getting that knowledge acquisition, and not going to be developing the skills that employers want in terms of being able to assimilate data and critique it and synthesize new ideas? So I think absolutely there is an element of student education here as well, in terms of teaching them how to use these tools in a way that is advantageous to them rather than disadvantageous to them.
Yeah. I'm just reading the one in the bottom is about from John, the skill that would be developed writing good prompts. When we're thinking through ungoogleable questions, there is an inherent skill in asking the right question and knowing that the output that you've been given addresses the question that you're actually wanting to ask. It's that sort of rubbish in, rubbish out answer. And from my looking at when I had online exams and I had what were clearly definition questions that could easily have been searched, quite often the wrong definition is replied back because the individual doesn't understand that the output is actually not relevant to the prompt, the initial prompt that was given. So there is a skill in being able to prompt and do it correctly. So, but the generation of that essay at the start only really worked because I knew what the prompts were. I knew what I was looking for before I started.
Just skimming through, I can't see any other.
Yeah, Benjamin's just made the same point in the chat about he's always amazed at how making prompts and search criteria is amazingly hard. I think we all have the story of students coming to us and I searched the internet and I can't find any information.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
What I'd like to do, just to sort of try and wrap this session up, is share the results of the poll that we did at the start. Hopefully that is going to be showing up on the screen. So the reason we put this together was really sort of a sort of a moral, ethical discussion of what we consider to be cheating. And I'm really pleased that when I put the poll up, a lot of the people were sort of saying that this is all context dependent. But I think it's really interesting that people, there's some people who are saying that sort of the use of spell check, for example, is cheating, that predictive text input or Grammarly are all cheating. And that very, very few people have actually said that something like EndNote is cheating. We actively encourage our students to use a piece of software like EndNote for consistency. But is it technically cheating? Because students are not generating that text themselves. And they're using a computer program to generate that text. And then they are copying and pasting or putting that directly into their documents. So it'd be really interesting to get some discussion going from the audience, if we can, about how and why people see different pieces of software being adopted and some becoming acceptable for use in higher education versus sort of things like ChatGPT, which is currently seen as a tool for cheating, or sites like Chegg, where you're putting in prompts and paying for a service. So I don't know if anybody would like to kick us off on that.
In with the big questions now, right from the start.
I mean, as one of the people who put GPT, that put the thing that we're talking about down as being cheating, but really nothing else. I didn't know what Chegg was, so I didn't kind of comment on that. For me, the difference between, say, EndNote or a spell check and something like ChatGPT is that ChatGPT is producing or representing something intellectually generated, whereas something like EndNote, even if a person is writing that, you are just reproducing something from a very kind of stock, readily available information. And I think that's where, and it may just be me getting increasingly older, gets kind of concerned about something which can produce kind of unique intellectual property in a way that EndNote is reproducing something which doesn't feel like it requires the same degree of thought.
Yeah. Interesting point.
Good point. So it's the intellectual capability. It's has the information gone through a mind and been processed and come out the other side that is important to you.
Yeah. I mean, I think particularly, my teaching primarily is a final year undergraduate and going into kind of masters. And I think it's when you start to look at some of those kind of pedagogical pyramids where you go from, can you reproduce information? That's a very early kind of, learning. Can you understand information is maybe a little bit kind of later. And then kind of at the top of that pyramid, you're maybe dealing with, can you produce new information? And that's obviously what we're generally looking at from maybe master's students and going into kind of doctoral levels and potentially what many of us as kind of academics are kind of looking to do in that side of our work. And I think that's where it makes me feel uncomfortable, is the idea that this could be used to produce or to simulate the production of new knowledge and the representation of that rather than the reproduction of existing knowledge.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to consider. Got a couple of hands up. Andrew, I think your hand went up first.
So I think that I tend to agree. So the EndNote question is very much that citation management demands uniformity. The actual being able to trace knowledge back through the annals of publication, it demands that it's done in a uniform way. So I think it's important that actually assistance is used there. With the other things, I feel that it all depends on how you use it. I think we're all scientists when we look at, well, I think most of you are scientists. Sorry, forgive me, that was an assumption. When we've been writing, when you put complicated molecule names in, your spell check's useless. And it's, or at least the first time, it's useless. You then need to add it to the dictionary, and then every single computer you come to, you then have to add that to the dictionary. It's an assistive tool. I think with the other things, again, it's how you use them. Even a Chegg answer, if used correctly, if used in the way that they advertise it to avoid accusations of contract cheating, then I think it can be a valid learning tool. The question is whether people are using it appropriately. And yeah, it's all context dependent. But certainly, I think whatever you do, copying and pasting things in, which is not your own work, and you haven't had an input into creating, we can agree that falls under a definition of plagiarism. And even coming down to the automatically generated images, the images themselves, whether copyright free or not, did the student produce the image? They may have had input into the creative process in terms of the prompts that they fed into the AI. But then if they need to say who their collaborator is. Their collaborator is the AI, which would be a valid way of doing it. But to say that it's their own work, it's not entirely their own work. That would be plagiarism. Anyway, that's me done.
That kind of links back to something that was mentioned in the chat, but the fact that some journals are out or sort of preventing the use of ChatGPT as a co-author, and it has been used as a co-author and acknowledged as such by some papers. So it's an interesting point on that. David, you had your hand up again.
Hi, sorry. I tend to talk a lot about authenticity or sustainable assessments and getting students to use the kind of things they're going to use in the real world. I haven't had to restriction map a sequence of DNA by eye for a long time, and I wouldn't expect a student to do that either. And, I used EndNote when I was a PhD student. Of course, we expect them to use the tools they're going to be using. And, I've used ChatGPT to make text for generic emails and for generic web pages. So I think, if we keep it in that context and keep it in that kind of spirit, then I think it's okay.
I'm interested in this debate about sort of the generation of new ideas, and where do we draw the line at that? Because technically, a tool like Grammarly is polishing and rewriting what you have put in as your ideas. Does that then become is that then your idea, that polished idea, where the text has perhaps been changed to make it clearer, more succinct, however Grammarly works in the background? Does that mean that you're not then writing in your voice? Does that then become cheating? And if anyone has got any thoughts on that?
I'm worried about that a lot, Nigel, because I use it on Grammarly consistently. It's embedded into every written piece of work that I've got. It's on my phone, it's in Google, it's pinging up in the bits around here. And it does change the voice, it does change the tone of what's being said. And you do worry that is this me that's saying this, or is this Grammarly that's saying this? But then equally, as being massively dyslexic, it benefit to my writing is that it'll all those words that I think are correct that aren't correct, it get flagged. All the structure stuff that just flies past through my mind gets picked up. So it's a cost benefit to me. I will take a little bit of a hit on losing my written voice to actually having a piece of document that is readable in the first place. So we're always back to this. It depends on the context problem.
And Andrew's raised a good point in the chat about it. So not always being correct. I mean, we can level that argument at the AI bots at the moment, and so but you can flag up to Grammarly that it's made a mistake as well, and you can point out that what it's suggesting is incorrect, and so we're helping to train Grammarly to become better as well. So it's an interesting sort of conflict there. David, you had your hand up again.
Yeah, it was actually following a little bit what David said there about people with who can't express themselves quite as fluently as they would like to. I'm thinking people with English as a second language. You know, if you can write something coherent and Grammarly can polish it in the English language into a, let's say, a more sophisticated or let's say more understandable error-free version, I think that's quite legitimate and a good help. And perhaps for dyslexia, I think as you mentioned there, you know, I think these are great uses of the tools, aren't they? I think so. Context is always going to be important, and if someone wants to get round doing some work and find an easy way of doing something they're not capable of doing, then of course it's cheating. But that's quite, you know, there's a very probably grey area somewhere in between all that.
Yes. So Matthew.
Yeah, I was just sort of following on from the same point, really, in that we're not, if it comes to using tools like Grammarly or indeed sort of any technical tool to help us communicate things, at the end of the day, I think most of us, you know, we're not teaching people to write creatively. What we want are people who can then go out into sort of whatever their chosen careers or professions are and are able to communicate as well as possible. And if you go into most jobs, they're not going to, you know, they want someone who would be able to communicate science. If it was any kind of scientific, you know, if there was any scientific communication involved there, they're not going to mind if you use Grammarly for that. So it's a perfectly viable tool for that. It's, you know, we have to think in terms of, you know, the overall interests of the students at the end of the day is hopefully giving them the skill set that's going to allow them to achieve when they leave university. You know, and there are advantages to sort of, you know, being able to use Grammarly in that context if, you know, automatically writing in a communicative way isn't something that comes as naturally to you as it does to others.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. And I think thinking about what we want our graduates to be able to do when they go out into the workplace is probably something that we're going to have to think about in terms of quite high level, program level assessment outcomes rather than individual module level assessment outcomes. But that's probably a debate for another webinar.
Yeah.
I've got one more hand out, so I can't see.
It's me again. So I think where just to continue, apparently I'm just going to be the kind of harbinger of doom for today. That's it's Thursday morning, so it seems apt for how my Thursdays usually go. I think where my concern kind of comes through with this, particularly and with some of the questions around would a student choosing not to use this potentially disadvantage themselves? And I think for me, there's always that question when there's a new piece of software or a new technique around of is there going to be a level at which it stops being acceptable? So Grammarly, I think, although when it first came about, and I'm dyslexic as well, so I kind of share certainly without Microsoft Spell Checker, I think I would have struggled to get where I've got in my career. Grammarly felt icky to me when it first came out, but I don't think it's changing anything kind of critical. My worry is that I think the more that the software can do the work for us, if it either can't do that very top level, or if we think it's inappropriate for it to do that very kind of top level of generating new knowledge, then do we end up in a situation where students come out of their undergraduate program or come out of their master's program without a core skill that we will then expect for them to have in the workplace, or we will then expect for them to have, you know, in a PhD program or in an academic job? And that's, I think, where I start to get a little bit kind of worried about some of these things, is that if it's something that can kind of get you a certain distance, but then can't kind of, but then you're not learning skills that you're going to need later on, then actually we're not giving our students the best chance to succeed, other than the best chance to get good grades. And those two things, and I think there's a bigger kind of philosophical problem around potentially the overassessment of young people, both in school, college, and at university, and that increasingly our students or students in general, I think, are more motivated by the grade outcome than the learning process along the way. And that's a much bigger, more fundamental discussion about how we operate as a sector and try and encourage understanding rather than performance. My concern is that something like this pushes us to performance without necessarily pushing understanding. And it may just be that I don't think I'm clever enough to come up with really nifty assessments that work with this software rather than go around it. And I think that's where you then also get the concern that the easy response to people who are maybe scared by this is in-person exams, oral presentations, no warning kind of assessments, and those things that might negatively affect students who have mental health problems become a way to block a potential problem.
Yeah, I think those are all really, really good, valid points and things that we are going to have to consider. I am conscious of the time coming up towards 12:30 when we said we were going to finish. From my perspective, it's been a really enlightening session. I think the take-home messages from this is that it's a rapidly evolving field, and that we still have a lot to think about and ponder as a sector and as individuals as to how we're going to embrace this technology and the way that we can hopefully try and enhance the student experience with these technologies rather than fighting against the students with these technologies. And I just wanted to sort of wrap this session up. Just hopefully this will work.
Do a lot of people not know if they're robots? Thank you for your confirmation. Please move through. What if I was a robot and I didn't know it? The machine would melt you from the inside out. Please move along, sir. Okay, I'm not a robot, so I'll be fine.
Really, all I wanted to end with that is we don't really know what's going to happen yet, and we're going to start questioning ourselves a little bit, I think. But hopefully, as a sector, we can all draw together, and in the spirit of these learning communities that we've set up here, we'll be stronger together. And I think we'll hopefully all be able to move the sector forward and sort of help solve some of the moral issues and dilemmas that we're all grappling with at the moment. So thank you all very much for your time and attention. Hopefully, we'll sort of arrange another webinar as this starts to evolve, and we'll keep everyone posted. But thank you very much for your time.